thought I was just buying a quiet house on a peaceful street, but I didn't know I had moved into a target zone for an international organized scheme. Before the first week was out, my neighborhood became a battlefield, and my front porch turned into a crime scene that would change everything. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted a house with a garden, a porch where I could drink my morning coffee, and the neighborhood quiet enough that the only thing interrupting my thoughts would be the rustle of oak leaves. When I signed the papers for the property on Willow Creek Drive, I saw the charm of the old architecture and the potential for a peaceful life. I didn't see the man living 3 doors down, a man whose entire existence seemed built on the shaky foundation of resentment and a desperate need to control space that didn't belong to him. His name was Arthur. From the moment my moving truck pulled into the driveway, I felt his eyes on me. It wasn't the curious gaze of a new neighbor welcoming someone to the block. It was the predatory, calculated stare of someone deciding that I was an intruder in a kingdom he had crowned himself ruler of. For the first 2 months, it was passive-aggressive behavior. He'd park his truck slightly over my property line, just enough to make backing out of my driveway a chore. He'd blow his lawn clippings onto my pristine grass the moment I finished mowing. I ignored it. I've lived long enough to know that some people are just miserable, and misery loves an audience I wasn't willing to provide. But then, things shifted. The petty grievances escalated into something darker. I started finding things on my doorstep: bags of trash, broken glass, notes written in jagged, frantic handwriting that told me, in no uncertain terms, that I didn't belong here, and that people like me were ruining the character of the street. I told myself it was just one angry man, a relic of a dying mindset. I kept my head down, locked my doors, and went about my life. I didn't know that my house, unknown to me, had been flagged by the government months before I even put in my first bid. The truth is, I've spent the better part of a decade working in the shadows. To my neighbors, I'm an independent consultant in data logistics. To the people who actually sign my paychecks, I'm an asset for the service of internal security. My job is delicate, analytical, and highly classified. I monitor the movement of funds related to a dangerous organized scheme, a network that has been operating in the dark for years. My house isn't just a home, it's a secure node. There are sensors in the walls, microphones that can pick up a whisper from 20 feet away, and cameras linked directly to a monitoring station that never sleeps. I didn't choose this house because it was cute. I chose it because it was the safest place in the county to house the equipment I operate. Arthur didn't know that. He didn't know that every time he stood on his porch and hurled slurs at me while I checked my mail, a digital log was being created, time-stamped, and stored on a server 3 states away. He thought he was terrorizing a lonely woman. He didn't realize he was building a case file that would eventually result in an investigation into his own finances, his history, and his connections. The tension finally snapped on a Tuesday evening in late October. The air was crisp, and the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. I was inside, reviewing an encrypted file on the illicit trade of prohibited substances that had recently been diverted through a local shipping port. I was so engrossed in the data that I didn't hear him walking up my driveway until the first heavy thud hit my front door. I looked at my monitor. The exterior camera showed Arthur. He was erratic, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. He was holding something behind his back, a heavy metallic object that caught the dim porch light. I felt the familiar, ice-cold calm of my training wash over me. I didn't panic. I checked my console. My colleagues in the Service of Internal Security had already been alerted the second he stepped onto my porch. They were watching. They were recording. But they were miles away, and he was right there. "I know you're in there," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can just march in here and change everything? You're a stain on this neighborhood. I'm going to make sure you never open that door again." I stood up, my hand hovering over the hidden panic button that would alert the local tactical team. But I hesitated. I wanted to see how far he would take it. I wanted the evidence to be undeniable. I wanted the charge against him to be so severe that no lawyer, no matter how expensive, could spin it away. I wanted his attempt to break my life to become the very thing that destroyed his. He swung the object. It looked like a heavy iron pry bar against the reinforced wood of my door with a deafening crack. Wood splintered and the frame groaned. He wasn't just venting, he was trying to breach the perimeter. "Come out, you coward!" he screamed, swinging again. The sound vibrated through the floorboards under my feet. I moved to the hallway, staying well out of sight of the windows, watching him on the high-definition feed. He was sweating, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like he was about to lose his grip on reality entirely. Just as he drew his arm back for a third, even harder strike, his phone rang. He fumbled with it, glancing at the screen, and for a split second, his face went pale. He answered, his voice trembling. "Yeah? What? No, I'm just—" He froze. He dropped the pry bar, the metal ringing against the concrete as if it were a gunshot. He looked up, not at my door, but directly into the lens of the porch camera, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. A black SUV, completely unmarked, pulled slowly onto the street, its headlights extinguished. It stopped right behind his truck, blocking him in. I held my breath. The game was no longer about his racism. It was about something much larger. He realized in that moment that he had stumbled into a trap he didn't even know existed. And then, the front door of the SUV opened, and 3 men in tactical gear stepped out, their faces obscured by balaclavas, moving with a synchronized precision that signaled they weren't here for a neighborhood dispute. They were here for him. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my handler. "Stay inside. Don't touch the door. We have everything we need." I didn't move. I stood in the center of my darkened hallway, the glow of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Outside, the world had shifted from a suburban nightmare into a tactical operation. Arthur looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He looked from the black SUV to my front door, his bravado replaced by a frantic, animalistic fear. The men didn't run. They walked toward him with a calculated, terrifying slowness. One of them, a man with a frame that seemed to dwarf the porch pillars, kept his hand resting near his side, where a holster was hidden beneath a windbreaker. They weren't police. The local department didn't move with this level of disciplined silence. This was the service of internal security, the people who handled threats to the nation, not neighborhood disputes. "Arthur," the lead man said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, authoritative tone that cut through the night air. "You're a long way from home." Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at the pry bar lying on my porch, then back at the men. His arrogance, which had fueled his harassment of me for months, was dissolving, replaced by the realization that he was an ant standing in the path of a steamroller. He didn't know who I was, but he was beginning to understand that he had picked the wrong house to target. He had no idea that his petty, bigoted crusade had tripped a wire connected to a federal investigation into a high-level organized scheme involving money laundering and the transit of illicit, prohibited substances. I was just, Arthur stammered, his eyes darting toward the street where the SUV now blocked his only path of egress. "You were busy," the agent replied, stepping onto the first riser of my porch. "We've been tracking your activities for quite some time, Arthur. Not just your late-night walks, but your contributions to the network that has been operating out of the warehouse on 4th Street. You thought you were just being a nuisance to your neighbor. You didn't realize you were being monitored as a secondary contact for a much larger, much more dangerous group." I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew we were investigating that warehouse, but I hadn't realized Arthur was a known entity to my agency. He wasn't just a racist neighbor, he was a small cog in a massive, ugly machine. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been targeting me because I was a black woman alone. He was targeting me because he suspected I was exactly who I was, a threat to his operation. "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur hissed, his voice regaining a thin, desperate edge of defiance. He took a step back, his heel catching on the edge of the porch. "This is private property. You have no right—" "We have a warrant," the agent interrupted, producing a document that he didn't even bother to hold out for Arthur to read. "And we have a long list of grievances, starting with attempted breaking and entering, but ending with something far more permanent. You've been linked to the movement of prohibited substances, and we've been looking for an excuse to bring you in without tipping off the rest of your network. Congratulations, Arthur. You just gave us the perfect opening." Arthur's face turned an ashen gray. He realized then that his life as he knew it, his house, his secrets, his petty control, was over. He tried to bolt, lunging toward the side of the porch. but the second agent moved with blurred speed, tackling him before he could clear the stairs. The sound of the struggle was muffled. No shouting, just the grunts of physical exertion and the harsh scrape of boots against wood. I watched the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. They had him pinned, zip ties clicking into place with a sound that felt final. One of the agents looked directly into the porch camera, his eyes narrowing as if he were looking through the lens and straight at me. He tapped his earpiece, and a second later, my phone pinged. "We are extracting the target. Remain in place. There is a second unknown vehicle approaching your location from the north. It is not one of ours. Get to the safe room immediately." The blood drained from my face. My breath hitched in my throat as I looked at the peripheral camera coverage on the edge of the street. Sure enough, a silver sedan with tinted windows was cruising slowly toward my house. Its headlights dimmed. It wasn't slowing down for the speed bumps. It was moving with purpose. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted toward the back of the house, toward the reinforced pantry that doubled as a hardened shelter. I punched in the code, the heavy steel door sliding open with a hiss of pressurized air. I dove inside just as the sound of screeching tires erupted from the street outside. I looked at the control panel inside the bunker, pulling up the live feed from the front yard just as the silver sedan swerved, mounting the curb and coming to a dead stop directly in front of my porch, nearly hitting the agents who were loading Arthur into their SUV. The driver's door of the silver sedan flew open, and a figure stepped out, holding something long and metallic that shimmered in the moonlight. Not a tool, not a pry bar, but a piece of heavy, illegal equipment meant for one purpose only. They weren't here to save Arthur. They were here to silence him before he could say a word to the agents. And I was standing right in the middle of a war zone. The monitor in the safe room pulsed with a harsh, red light as the feed captured the chaos outside. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest, but my hands remained steady, conditioned by years of simulated drills that never quite prepared me for the real thing. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the situation on my front lawn transformed from a tactical extraction into an active combat zone. The figure who had emerged from the silver sedan moved with the cold, calculated aggression of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to hide. They didn't shout. They didn't offer warnings. They raised the illegal weapon, the barrel leveled directly at the agents who were struggling to secure Arthur in the back of the black SUV. The moonlight caught the cold steel of the equipment, and I recognized the silhouette. It was a modification of an industrial-grade prohibited tool, capable of punching through ballistic glass. "Contact!" one of the agents roared, his voice distorted by the proximity to the porch microphone. Everything turned into a blur of motion. The agents didn't retreat. They executed a textbook maneuver, shielding their bodies behind the heavy doors of their vehicle. The silence of the quiet suburban night was shattered by the rhythmic, deafening cracks of projectiles finding purchase in the siding of my house and the metal frame of the SUV. Sparks showered the grass as the shooter unleashed a volley, the sound echoing through the neighborhood like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Arthur, still zip-tied and effectively defenseless, scrambled on the ground, his face pressed into the dirt, screaming for them to stop. He was a piece of trash, a man who had made my life a living hell for months. But seeing him there, cowering in the crossfire, made me realize just how deep this rabbit hole went. They weren't just here to arrest him. They were here to sanitize the scene. This was a liquidator. My pulse surged as I realized the shooter wasn't just aiming at the agents. They were spraying the house, specifically the windows where my sensors were located, methodically knocking out my surveillance grid. One by one, the feeds flickered to static. The porch view went dark. The side garden went dark. I was losing my eyes, one by one. "Stay behind the steel," my internal voice commanded. But the instinct to protect my work, the data, the evidence, the months of effort, took over. I reached for the manual override, trying to reroute the camera feeds to the secondary server located in the crawl space beneath the house. If I could get just one angle back, I could call in an air support team or local backup. Suddenly, the screen showing the driveway went black, replaced by a jagged, red diagnostic error. The shooter had found the main junction box on the side of the house. They knew the layout. They knew where the infrastructure was hidden. A cold realization washed over me. This wasn't a random hit. This was a targeted strike by people who had been watching the watchers. I turned to the heavy wall of the safe room, feeling the vibration of the house as a heavy object, likely a vehicle or an explosive, slammed into the exterior wall. Dust shook from the ceiling, coating my hair in a fine gray powder. The room was soundproofed, but I could feel the concussive force of the attack vibrating through my soles. I checked my encrypted comms device. The line was dead. The silence was absolute. A terrifying vacuum in a house that was usually humming with the life of 1,000 data streams. Then, a low, melodic tone echoed through the safe room. A message appeared on the screen, bypassing the corrupted network. It wasn't from my handler. It was a direct bypass, sent from a local transmitter. "We know you're in the bunker, Agent. We don't want the house. We want the drive." My stomach twisted. They knew my identity. They knew the classification of my work. The data logistics cover was blown, and the game had shifted from neighborhood harassment to a full-scale assault on national security assets. I lunged for the server drive, the physical repository of every interaction, every money transfer, and every illicit conversation I had tracked for the past 6 months. It was a small, silver brick of titanium alloy, pulsing with a faint blue light. If they got their hands on this, the entire investigation into the organized scheme would collapse. Worse, every contact I had made, every informant I had cultivated, would be exposed to the wolves. I ripped the drive from its cradle, the cables snapping like hair-thin spider silk. I had a single escape route, a concealed hatch beneath the floorboards that led to an old drainage pipe running under the property line. It was small, cramped, and smelled of damp earth and rust, but it was my only shot. I pulled the heavy latch, the iron hinges groaning as they gave way. I climbed down, pulling the hatch shut just as I heard the distinct, heavy thud of boots hitting the floor above my head. The house was being breached. I crawled into the darkness of the pipe, the wet sludge seeping into my clothes, my heart hammering against the cold walls of the tunnel. I had barely moved 10 feet when the floorboards above me exploded inward. The light from the hallway spilled down into the dark cavity, and I saw a pair of combat boots stop right at the edge of the open hatch. A voice, smooth and chillingly calm, drifted down to me. "You're very thorough, Agent. But you forgot one thing. You aren't the only one who knows how to use this house." The floorboards suddenly groaned under an immense weight, and a heavy grate, one I hadn't even known existed, slid open directly in front of me, cutting off my path. I froze, the silver drive gripped so tightly in my hand that the edges began to bite into my palm. I looked up, and through the grate, I saw a face I had seen every morning for the last 3 months, a face that had once smiled and waved at me from across the street. The mask had finally dropped, and the neighbor I thought I knew was staring down at me with a weapon leveled directly at my head. The face peering down at me wasn't Arthur's. It was the face of the man who lived in the quiet, unassuming split level on the other side of my fence. Mr. Henderson, the retired librarian who always tipped his hat and asked about my garden. He was looking at me with a detached professional neutrality that was far more terrifying than Arthur's rage. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man checking off a grocery list. "You really should have been more careful with your landscaping, Agent," Henderson said, his voice echoing in the cramped, damp confines of the pipe. "If you hadn't insisted on that extra-large irrigation system, we wouldn't have been able to map these tunnels months ago. You practically handed us the blueprints to your own bunker." I didn't answer. I stayed frozen, my breath hitched in my throat, my fingers white-knuckling the titanium drive. I needed a distraction, something, anything that would give me a half-second to pull my sidearm from the holster strapped to my thigh. I could hear the other agents outside still engaged in a firefight with the shooter who had arrived in the sedan. The sounds of metallic impacts and muffled shouting were muffled by the earth, but they were still there. If I could keep Henderson talking, maybe the backup team would eventually clear the yard and realize I was missing. "You're part of the network, then," I managed to say, my voice sounding hollow in the dark. "All this time, the quiet neighbor act?" Henderson chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The network is everywhere, Agent. It's in the mail you receive, the groceries you buy, the neighbors you trust. You thought you were watching us, but you were merely being observed. You are a variable in an equation we've been balancing for years. And variables that don't fit, they get removed." He started to reach for the latch of the grate, his hand moving with a slow, hypnotic precision. I saw the weapon in his other hand, a silenced pistol, compact and deadly. My muscles coiled. I knew I couldn't win a standoff, but I could force a mistake. I shifted my weight, pressing my heels against the slick clay of the tunnel floor, preparing to kick the grate the moment he touched it. "You know," I said, leaning forward just enough to draw his attention, "the internal security team isn't just outside. They've been tracking your signals since you stepped onto my property. They didn't just come for Arthur. They came for the entire node." Henderson paused. His eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his icy exterior. It was all I needed. I didn't wait for him to process the bluff. I kicked the grate with every ounce of strength in my legs. It swung outward, catching him off guard and slamming into his shoulder. He stumbled back, the pistol whipping upward, and a suppressed thwip sent a round pinging into the dirt inches from my head. I scrambled out of the pipe, ignoring the filth covering my clothes, and dived toward the basement stairs. I didn't head for the living room. I headed for the utility room, where I knew the main power grid was housed. "Get her!" I heard him yell, his voice losing its composure. "I don't care if you have to burn the house down. Get that drive!" Heavy boots thundered into the basement behind me. I reached the utility room, slammed the door, and locked it. It was a flimsy piece of wood, but it would buy me 5 seconds. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench and smashed the emergency bypass box. The house plummeted into total darkness. My night vision goggles, which were strapped to my tactical vest, were already active, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of ghostly light and shadow. The door splintered. Henderson burst into the room, his eyes scanning the pitch-black space. He didn't have night vision. He was at a massive disadvantage. I pressed myself against the rafters, hanging suspended like a spider, watching him move through the dark with a flashlight that only revealed his position. He scanned the corners, his breath ragged. He was panicking now. The professional, cold librarian was gone, replaced by a desperate hunter. I dropped from the rafters, not directly on him, but behind him, using the momentum to slam the wrench into his wrist. The pistol skittered across the concrete floor. I didn't reach for it. I reached for his collar, slamming him against the brick foundation. "Who are you working for?" I hissed, pinning him with my forearm. He laughed, even as I applied pressure to his throat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant in the green glow of my visor. "You don't understand, Agent. We aren't working for a person. We're working for the future. And that drive? It's not just evidence. It's a key. You think you're the hero of this story? You're just the one who opened the door." He reached into his jacket pocket, but it wasn't for a weapon. He pulled out a small metallic remote, a dead man's switch. Before I could stop him, his thumb depressed the button. The house groaned. A deep subterranean rumble shook the foundation, and I realized with a sudden sinking horror that the tremors weren't coming from outside. They were coming from underneath us. The entire house was rigged with something volatile. Not a standard explosive, but something meant to vaporize every trace of evidence, every record, and everyone inside. The walls began to crack, the floor sinking toward the center of the room. The lights on my vest flashed red, a proximity warning. I had less than 10 seconds before the entire structure collapsed into a sinkhole. I looked at Henderson, who was smiling at the ceiling, waiting for the end. I looked at the drive in my hand, then at the stairs that were already dissolving into dust. There was no way out through the basement. I had to go up, into the collapsing house, into the inferno. And then the floor beneath us simply vanished. The sensation of falling was brief, a violent wrenching of gravity that ended in a jarring, bone-rattling impact against a stack of crates in the crawlspace below. The floor above us had disintegrated, effectively swallowing the utility room, Henderson, and me in one catastrophic collapse. Dust, debris, and the sharp scent of ozone filled the air, turning the basement into a tomb of splintered joists and broken concrete. I landed hard on my side, the wind knocked out of me, but my hand, clutched instinctively against my chest, never let go of the titanium drive. Above me, the house was screaming. I could hear the structural steel groaning as the house buckled into the sinkhole created by the explosives. Henderson was gone, buried under a mountain of drywall and heavy timber, his laughter silenced by the sheer weight of his own destruction. I knew I had mere moments before the remaining gas lines ruptured, or the instability brought the rest of the structure down on my head. I didn't think. I moved. I scrambled through the thick, swirling dust, my night vision goggles flickering as they struggled to process the debris-filled air. I recalled the blueprints of the foundation, The emergency egress was located behind the main furnace, a reinforced chute designed for situations exactly like this. I clawed through the darkness, pulling myself over broken bricks and twisted pipes, my muscles burning with adrenaline. I reached the furnace, pushing against the heavy steel plate that masked the tunnel. It was jammed. With a roar of effort, I braced my legs against a support beam and heaved. The metal gave with a sickening screech, sliding open just enough for me to squeeze through. I lunged into the small chute, sliding down the incline just as a massive fireball erupted from the center of the basement, the heat searing the air behind me like the breath of a dragon. I tumbled out onto the wet grass of the backyard, gasping for air, the cool night breeze hitting my face like a baptism. I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and didn't look back at the inferno that had once been my home. The evidence of my life and my work incinerated in a single, cold-blooded act of sabotage. I ran toward the tree line where I knew my extraction vehicle would be waiting if the plan had held. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A sleek black sedan pulled up, the driver's side door opening before the car had even come to a full stop. It was Miller, my field handler. His face, usually a mask of bureaucratic indifference, was etched with a rare, raw concern. "Get in!" he shouted over the roar of the fire consuming the house. I scrambled into the passenger seat, my clothes shredded and covered in the soot of the collapse. As the car sped away, leaving the flickering orange hell of Willow Creek Drive behind, I finally opened my hand. The titanium drive was scorched, the casing pitted by the heat, but the integrity of the data was intact. I tossed it onto the console. "Henderson is dead," I wheezed, my voice barely a whisper. "He had a remote. The whole house is gone." Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "We saw. The local precinct is already being fed a story about a massive gas main failure. The organized scheme thinks they've wiped the slate clean. They think they've killed the agent and destroyed the evidence." He reached over and tapped the drive. "You did more than just survive, Agent. You brought back the names. Every contact, every shell company, every corrupted official in their network. Because they were so confident in their destruction, they didn't realize that the backup was physical. You've given us the roadmap to dismantle their entire operation within 48 hours. I leaned back, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. I had lost everything. My home, my peace, my quiet life on Willow Creek Drive. I had been forced to kill, to run, and to watch the place I lived be reduced to rubble. But as I looked at the drive, I realized the cost was worth it. The investigation, which had once been a slow-moving, cautious observation, turned into a lightning strike. By the end of the week, the organized scheme had been dismantled from the top down. The warehouse on 4th Street, the shell companies, and the money laundering hubs, all of them fell like dominoes, exposed by the data I had pulled from the fire. Arthur, Henderson, and the rest of their network were either behind bars or under intense, inescapable scrutiny, facing the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in a concrete cell for their roles in the conspiracy. A month later, I sat in a new office, in a different city, staring at a blank wall. It was quiet here too, but I didn't drink my coffee on the porch anymore. I didn't plant a garden. I had learned the hard way that when you live in the shadows, you never truly own the space you inhabit. But as I watched the sunrise, I felt a strange sense of peace. The neighbors were just neighbors now. The house was just a house. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just an asset in a file. I was finally, truly, in control of my own story. I didn't need a symbol or a secret, just the quiet certainty that no matter how hard they tried to bury the truth, it would always, eventually, come to light.